In the cramped belly of a B-17 bomber, an electrician's improvised, shortcut wire loop changed the fate of its gunners. This simple fix transformed scattered fire into a relentless curtain of lead, turning vulnerable crews into fierce defenders against relentless enemy fighters. Winter settled over the English countryside in 1943, thickening the morning fog that clung to the airfields. Rows of B-17 flying fortresses filled the runways, their massive frames silhouetted against the pale gray sky. Engines idled with a low, steady rumble, mixing with the distant clatter of boots on concrete and the murmurs of crews moving between planes and hangars. The cold bit through worn leather jackets and wool uniforms, sharp and unrelenting. Inside the mess hall, small groups of airmen sat at wooden tables, eating in silence. Faces were drawn, eyes often fixed on the mission board that would soon dictate the day's orders. Among them were gunners, many no older than teenagers, their hands steady despite the undercurrent of tension. They wiped down their .50 caliber machine guns with careful precision, oiling mechanisms and inspecting barrels as if each stroke might stave off danger for another moment. The smell of grease mixed with sweat and damp wool coats, filling the room with a heavy scent of preparation. Nearby, in a dim corner of a hangar coated with grime and the faint odor of fuel, a base electrician crouched over a workbench cluttered with wires and tools. His hands worked quickly and quietly, twisting copper strands and connecting circuits with practiced ease. Around him, mechanics and airmen voiced complaints. Too many controls cluttered the cockpit, too many tasks for too few hands, and never enough time to rest or feel alive. Their voices were low, strained, carrying the weight of exhaustion and fear. The electrician paused, weighing the risk of what he was about to do. With a glance around the hangar, he soldered a small, shortcut wire loop designed to simplify the bomber's electrical systems. He knew such a modification could mean a court-martial if caught, yet the brutal reality of air combat demanded every advantage. He handed the device off quietly, eyes meeting those of a pilot who understood the unspoken urgency. Outside, the fog thickened again as crews finished preparations. The war in the air was relentless, a battle of precision and timing. On the ground, every second gained or lost carried the weight of survival. The base held its breath, waiting for the orders that would send these young men into the cold, gray sky. Before dawn, the air hung cold and dense over the airfield. Frost glazed the pavement in a thin, brittle sheet, crunching faintly under worn boots. A single B-17 stood like a dark sentinel against the pale, gray sky. Its metal skin was dull and matte, touched here and there by lingering moisture that glistened like tiny crystals in the fragile light. By the waist gunner's turret, a soldier stood rigid, his breath visible in shallow puffs. He wore the standard olive drab uniform, the fabric stiff from the cold, creaking softly as he moved. His fingers, numb but deliberate, traced the familiar cold steel of his twin .50 caliber machine guns. The worn metal was slick, the barrels chilled like ice against his skin. His hands moved slowly over each trigger lever, counting silently. 1, 2. He flexed his fingers, feeling the slight resistance in the mechanism. He tested the travel of the triggers, imagining the seconds it would take to switch hands if the situation demanded. Left to right, right to left, every motion rehearsed, quick but precise. The weight of the guns anchored him, a tangible connection to the fight ahead. His gaze lifted briefly toward the hangar, where shadows gathered in the pre-dawn gloom. The air was still except for the distant murmur of other men preparing their aircraft. The low hum of diesel engines warmed in the chill, and the faint scrape of boots on pavement broke the silence in irregular bursts. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving with slow, purposeful steps. The electrician approached, his uniform smudged with grease and dirt, the marks of long hours spent under wings and engines. He held a small object in his palm, a delicate loop of copper wire, catching the scant light like a thread of fire. "Try this," he whispered, voice low, almost swallowed by the cold. There was no hurry in his tone, only quiet confidence. The electrician's eyes met the gunner, for a brief moment, steady and calm. Then, almost without a sound, he stepped closer. The waist gunner took the loop, fingers brushing the electrician's rough hand. His eyes flicked toward the non-commissioned officers nearby, their figures blurred in the morning mist. No one seemed to notice this small exchange, no questions asked. Carefully, he threaded the copper loop through both trigger levers, feeling the fine metal slide against the cold steel. The wire was thin but firm, binding the triggers together just enough to allow a smoother motion between them. He tested the movement again, senses alert to the difference. There was a subtle ease now, less hesitation if switching hands became necessary during the mission. The electrician nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that needed no words. Then he stepped back, fading into the shadows of the hangar, swallowed by the quiet dimness. His figure melted into the gloom, leaving the gunner alone with the aircraft and the frost. The gunner's breath came steady, slow. The copper wire felt like a small promise in his palm. A tool, yes, but also a quiet bond to the men who labored unseen, ensuring the guns would fire when it mattered most. Around him, the airfield stirred to life as first light edged closer. Engines rumbled to readiness, footsteps multiplied, and the frozen ground began to absorb the day's coming warmth. Yet here in the stillness before the storm, the waist gunner remained rooted, fingers resting lightly on the triggers, waiting for the moment when hours, seconds, and courage would all collide. The briefing room was dim, the low ceiling stained by years of smoke and soot. Cigarette butts burned down in metal ashtrays, some smoldering still. The air clung thick and heavy, a haze that settled in the lungs and eyes. Men sat rigid in wooden chairs, the sharp tang of fear mingling with tobacco and sweat. A large map was pinned to a board at the front, creased and marked with chalk lines, tracing a jagged path to Bremen. The city name stood out under a circle, a distant dot on the map but a looming threat in their minds. They studied the route in silence, the faint scratch of chalk on paper the only sound besides the occasional cough. The gunners wore their leather jackets and canvas harnesses, stained and worn from yesterday's mission. Their faces were pale, rims of dark shadows beneath their eyes. The blast of flak still echoed in their ears, a persistent ringing that no amount of silence could banish. Fingers tapped nervously on knees, boots shifted on the cold floor. Among them, the waist gunner sat with a stiff back, his gaze fixed on the map, though his mind replayed the chaos from the previous day. He reached into his jacket pocket and felt the cold loop of wire tucked there, the metal smooth but heavy. It was a small thing, but its weight grounded him in the moment, a reminder of what was at stake. His friend, the tail gunner, leaned over quietly with a faint, dry chuckle. "Maybe if we take a shortcut we'll save some trouble," he muttered, voice low and rough. "But I suppose the price for getting caught ain't worth the detour." The corner of his mouth twitched, a grim smirk rather than a smile. The captain stood before them, his face drawn and serious, framed by the dim light that cast deep shadows across his features. His voice cut through the murmur like a knife. "Listen up. No improvising. Follow the plan exactly." His eyes swept over the men, steady and unyielding. "Deviation means death. There's no room for shortcuts." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the room. The men shifted, some swallowing hard, others staring down at their boots. The captain added quietly, "We fly as one. Trust the formation. Trust the orders." The map was lowered, and the lights flickered as the briefing came to an end. One by one the men stood, muscles stiff from hours of waiting. The smoke hung in the air, reluctant to disperse. The waist gunner's hand closed tightly around the wire loop again, fingers curling around it with a silent vow. The room emptied slowly. Boots clacked against the floorboards, voices hushed but tense. The captain was the last to leave, pausing by the door to glance back once more at the empty chairs, and the faint outline of the map still pinned to the board. Outside, the cold air bit at their faces as they moved toward the aircraft. Inside the waist gunner's pocket, the loop weighed like a small anchor, a quiet reminder of honor and duty carried into the gray dawn. The early morning haze lay thick over the airfield, muting the sharp outlines of the B-17 bombers lined up on the cracked concrete. Engines rumbled unevenly, a low mechanical growl that grew steadily louder as pilots pushed throttles forward. The air was heavy with the scent of fuel and hot oil, mixed with the faint metallic tang inside the aircraft. Inside the waist compartment of one bomber, the gunner settled into his cramped station. The narrow space pressed close on all sides, the metal walls cold and rigid under his hands. His gloves felt bulky, but necessary against the chill seeping through the fuselage. He reached behind his helmet, fingers steady despite the tightening knot in his stomach. He clipped the oxygen hose to the connector near his neck. The hose hissed softly, delivering a steady flow of pure air. The faint hiss masked the distant thrum of the engines outside. He adjusted the strap, careful not to dislodge it once the plane taxied. His breath came measured, controlled, even though the rhythm of his heart tried to quicken. Next, he reached for the wire loop resting on the worn metal panel. His fingers found the cold steel, lifting it deliberately. With a practiced motion, he threaded the loop through the triggers of the twin .50 caliber machine guns mounted on each side. The loop bridged both triggers, enabling him to fire them simultaneously. There was no room for error. The cabin vibrated as the engine surged, a deep bass trembling through the thin metal skin. The vibration traveled through the frame, rattling loose items and settling deep into every joint and muscle. The gunner flexed his fingers, feeling the cold metal under his palms shift slightly with the motion. He reached up, pressed the safety catch aside, and squeezed the triggers. A sudden roar shattered the brief silence as both guns fired. The sound was brutal and immediate, the recoil jolting his arms. Spent shell casings ejected with sharp clacks, hitting the floor and bouncing against the metal ribs. The cabin filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and hot metal. He released the triggers quickly, the echo fading to a heavy silence broken only by the engine's persistent growl. His eyes scanned the cramped space, searching for any sign of malfunction or hesitation. None appeared. The guns were ready. The machine was ready. From the tail section, the tail gunner's silhouette appeared in the narrow corridor. Their eyes met briefly through the small window dividing the sections. No words passed between them, but the look was loaded, an exchange heavier than any conversation. The tail gunner's nod was slow, deliberate, a quiet affirmation of shared duty. The tension hung thick in the confined space, unspoken but inseparable from the moment. Both men understood the stakes. Each mission carried the weight of countless lives and the fragile hope of return. The risk was ever present, as real as the vibration beneath their feet. Outside the windows, the airfield's static figures, other men, ground crew, officers, blurred against the rising light. The engine's growl swelled further as the bomber began to roll forward, tires humming against the uneven surface. The plane's metal frame shook, steady and purposeful, preparing to lift into the uncertain sky. The gunner's gaze flicked once more to the loop triggers, then to the thin stream of oxygen entering his mask. Every breath counted. Every heartbeat was a silent prayer. The moment stretched taut, holding them both in a fragile balance between the calm before action and the chaos soon to come. The quiet nod from the tail gunner remained, a steadfast signal of honor and shared resolve. No bravado or false courage, only the sober recognition of their roles in a vast, dangerous conflict. The weight of that recognition settled deep in the gunner's chest, steadying him against the rush of fear and the pull of hope. The bomber's wheels left the ground with a shudder, rising slowly through the low clouds that hung over the field. Inside, the vibration shifted, less of the earth below and more of the air moving past. The gunner tightened his grip, eyes sharp, senses alert. The war stretched out behind them and ahead, unseen but palpably close. For now, the only sound was the steady drone of engines and the quiet exchange of a nod, an unspoken promise to stand watch, to hold fast, to honor the mission and each other. Above the endless gray expanse of the North Sea, the bomber formation tightened its ranks. The sky was a heavy ceiling of low clouds, blotting out the sun and casting the metal aircraft into muted shadow. A chill wind swept over the wings, carrying the sharp scent of oil and cold steel. The drone of the engines was steady, but strained under the weight of urgency. Pilots kept their eyes on the instruments and the shifting horizon, alert to every movement in the air. Inside the rear turret, the gunner leaned forward, his breath shallow and steady despite the cold pressing at his face through the glass. His hands gripped both triggers of the twin machine guns, fingers wrapped tightly around the cool metal. The shortcut wire loop rested just beneath his right hand, looped around his index finger, ready to close the circuit in an instant. The turret was cramped and cold, the leather straps biting into his shoulders as the plane shook slightly with each engine pulse. A sharp crackle sounded through the radio headset, breaking the low hum in the turret. "Bandits, 3 o'clock," the voice reported crisply from the lead pilot. The gunner's heart quickened. Outside, shadows flickered against the cloud bank. Enemy fighters cut through the sky, their dark silhouettes slicing toward the formation like knives. The distant roar of their engines was sharper, more aggressive, punctuated by the occasional whistle of a shell passing nearby. The gunner's hands tightened around the triggers, his knuckles white beneath the thin gloves. The weight of the moment pressed down hard, mingling control and fear. His eyes fixed on the approaching fighters, scanning the shapes as they closed in fast. The cold metal of the turret frame pressed against his cheek, sweat dampening the back of his neck despite the chill. Each breath came in short, controlled bursts, the sound muffled under the headset. As the enemy fighters closed to firing range, the gunner steadied his aim. His fingers flexed slightly on the shortcut wire loop, the thin wire poised against his trigger finger. The tension in his arms was raw, muscles coiled against the sudden surge of adrenaline. A single movement could unleash a burst of gunfire, the sharp staccato that might decide life or death in the next seconds. Then, with a sudden jolt, the first fighter slashed across his field of vision. The gunner squeezed the triggers simultaneously. Both guns roared to life, spitting tracer rounds into the thickening air. The sharp report echoed through the turret, vibrations trembling through his arms and chest. Brass casings ejected rapidly, rattling against the fuselage in a relentless clatter. The smell of burning powder filled the cramped space, mingling with the cold metal and engine oil. He felt the recoil kick through his wrists, the guns thrumming under his grip. His hands trembled, not from weakness but from the intensity of the moment, the flood of noise and danger pressing in. The shortcut wire loop held steady beneath his finger, a lifeline linking him to the weapon's sudden fury. Each burst tore through the sky, streams of glowing tracer bullets marking the fighters' desperate evasions. Outside, the enemy planes twisted and banked, trying to evade the withering fire. The gunner's eyes tracked every movement, muscles straining for precision. The sky was a chaotic swirl of metal and smoke, the sounds of engines, gunfire, and shouted orders mixing into a harsh symphony. The bomber's frame shuddered as a nearby tracer passed, the sharp ping of a bullet against metal echoing inside the fuselage. Despite the roar and the shaking, the gunner's mind sharpened. He felt a grim satisfaction in the power coursing through his hands, the sense of control amid the chaos. But beneath it lay a deeper fear, steady and cold, the knowledge that with each pull of the trigger, lives hung in the balance. The enemy fighters were not mere targets, but men like himself, caught in the same deadly game. The gunfire slowed as the attackers veered off, their formations breaking apart under the concentrated defense. The radio came alive again with calls and orders, the voices tense but resolute. The gunner's breath came heavier now, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving his hands shaking with the effort. He kept the shortcut wire loop secure, reluctant to release the grip until the danger passed completely. The turret grew quiet, save for the steady hum of the engines and the creak of the plane settling back into its steady course. Outside, the clouds shifted, the light dim and cold. The gunner lowered his hands slowly, muscles aching but alert. He removed his headset for a moment, the silence pressing in, filled only with the low rumble around him. In that brief stillness, the gunner felt the weight of what had passed: power, fear, survival. The battle had been a momentary tempest, but its echo settled deep in his bones. The taste of gunpowder lingered on his lips. The memory of the guns recoil a lasting impression. The sky outside remained vast and indifferent, the fight just one small thread in the endless expanse above the sea. He exhaled slowly and tightened the straps of his harness. The formation was still close, the plane steady in the cold, gray sky. The radio crackled again with updates, but for now, the gunner's eyes rested on the cloudy horizon. The weight of honor and duty pressed quiet and heavy, as real as the metal beneath his hands. Outside, the sky seemed to shudder beneath a sudden bloom of flak bursts. Each explosion scattered thick, dark smoke across the pale blue, punctuated by jagged fragments of metal. The sharp crack of artillery shells breaking apart filled the air, sharp and unrelenting. The aircraft trembled with each nearby detonation, metal groaning faintly beneath the passenger cabin floor. Inside the cramped turret, the gunner's breath fogged behind his oxygen mask, the plastic visor frosting from the cold at altitude. His lungs forced air through the mask with every measured breath, the sterile hiss a constant undercurrent. Hangar echoes of distant bangs and rushing wind merged into a steady drone, broken only by the staccato bursts of his own gunfire. Both barrels of the machine gun ran hot, the metal humming beneath his gloves. The repeated recoil rocked his arms, his fingers firm on the trigger and charging handles. Sweat beaded at his hairline, freezing upon contact with the cold steel of the turret frame. The wire loop of the trigger mechanism pressed sharply into the thick leather of his glove, biting with each squeeze. Suddenly, a shape flashed past the open waist window, a dark silhouette against the churning clouds and smoke. A Messerschmitt, its fuselage trailing smoke like a wounded beast, skimming dangerously close. The enemy fighter weaved erratically, its engine rasping a harsh shriek that cut through the din. From the opposite waist window, his friend's voice cracked loudly over the rush of wind and gunfire. "Got him," the words were brief, clipped, but carried a weight heavier than the roar surrounding them. The gunner's eyes narrowed behind the mask, watching the smoking plane falter then disappear into the far horizon. He gave a slow nod, barely moving his head under the turret's curved glass. The gesture was small, nearly imperceptible, but it held the quiet relief born from shared survival. His breath hitched, the cold air biting deeper into his lungs as adrenaline drained slowly, replaced by a sharp fatigue. The turret's metal surface pressed cold against his cheek, grounding him amid the chaos. The faint smell of burnt powder, oil, and cold metal lingered in the enclosed space, mixing with the sharp tang of sweat and breath. Outside, more bursts bloomed, but none as close as before. His fingers loosened briefly on the trigger, the barrels cooling with the brief pause. His eyes flicked across the scattered clouds, scanning the sky for any sign of regrouping foes. The bomber's engines droned steadily beneath him, a mechanical heartbeat in the fragile storm. In the silence between explosions, the distant thump of other aircraft engines echoed faintly. The faint vibration beneath his seat was constant, a reminder of the fragile metal bird holding them aloft. The gunner's chest rose and fell steadily, his breaths measured and careful beneath the ice-covered mask. The wire loop pressing into his gloved hand was a small, sharp reminder of the endless tension. Each squeeze a choice to survive another moment, to honor the fight and protect the crew behind him. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, though the words remained unspoken. Outside, the sky slowly cleared of immediate threats, but the air remained thick with danger. Every rattling breath and metallic clink inside the turret was amplified in the stillness that followed the fight. The gunner lowered his weapon slowly, not out of relief, but out of the need to steady his shaking hands. His eyes met the glass, watching the horizon where the last smudges of smoke vanished. The faint light of the dying sun cast long shadows inside the bomber, dim but steady. Somewhere behind him, the distant murmur of voices carried, calm yet tense. He felt the cold seep into his bones, the mixture of sweat and frost rigid on his skin. For a fleeting moment, the danger felt suspended in time, the weight of loss and honor pressing quietly against his ribs. A single thought lingered in the silence: the fight was not yet over. The drone of the engines filled the cramped metal cabin, steady and relentless. Suddenly, a harsh, metallic clang shattered the rhythm as the port engine shuddered violently. The plane lurched sharply to the left, throwing every man off balance within. The air inside thickened with tension, mingling the scent of burning oil and heated metal. The gunner nearest the window was thrown sideways, his shoulder slamming hard against the cold steel bulkhead. A sharp breath escaped him, pain flaring briefly before he scrambled upright, eyes wide, hands searching for the cold weight of his machine guns. Sweat beaded at his brow, despite the chill seeping through the thin cabin walls. His fingers closed around the gun handles, knuckles white with the sudden exertion. The shortcut wire connected to the guns, a slender, vital link to their firing mechanism, slipped loose in the violent motion, dangling precariously. Time slowed as he reached out, trembling fingers fumbling to catch the wire before it could fall into the dark void beneath. With a desperate twist, he jammed the wire firmly back into its slot. The metal clicked sharply, a small victory amid chaos. His heart hammered painfully in his chest, each beat a drum of urgency. The cabin vibrated under the strain of the damaged engine, groaning with the stress of uneven power. A sudden crackle erupted from the intercom, breaking the tense silence. Voices barked orders and warnings, urgent and raw. The gunner's ears strained to catch the fragments, the pilot's calm commands, the navigator's quick reports. Static hissed between the shouts, but the message was clear. The enemy remained close, and their survival depended on steady fire. He raised the twin guns once more, muscles taut with focus. His breath came in measured bursts, hands steady despite the tremors that threatened to betray him. The sky outside stretched wide and cold, pale clouds drifting past like ghosts. Silver streaks of tracer bullets tore through the thin air, sharp against the gray backdrop. Both barrels roared simultaneously, spitting fire and smoke as the gunner squeezed the triggers. The sound was deafening inside the cabin, shaking his bones. Each volley sent a spray of glowing slugs into the heavens, a desperate barrier between them and the unseen enemy below. His eyes narrowed, tracking the fleeting shapes that darted just beyond reach. The guns kicked with each shot, jolting his arms, but he held firm. Around him, the plane groaned and pitched, the wounded engine sputtering but still laboring against the sky's pull. The world narrowed to the rhythm of firing, the weight of responsibility pressing down like the cold steel beneath his fingers. Every bullet discharged was a silent testament to the lives depending on him. The gunner's breath caught on a sudden jolt as the plane tilted again, flinging him against the bulkhead once more. Pain flared in his ribs, sharp and immediate. Ignoring the ache, he steadied himself, hands gripping the guns tighter. The shortcut wire trembled but held its position, a fragile lifeline in the chaos. The intercom hissed again, voices raised in warning and encouragement, the men clinging to their roles amid the storm. Outside, the tracer fire arced in precise, deadly lines, silver threads woven through the cold blue-gray sky. Each shot was a fragment of defiance, a measure of honor carved in the silence between explosions. The gunner's world reduced to the weight of the guns, the crackle of the intercom, and the distant roar of the damaged engine struggling for life. Minutes passed like hours, marked only by the relentless firing and the shudder of the wounded plane. The gunner's arms burned, sweat stinging his eyes, but he did not lower the guns. In that suspended moment, amid the noise and the fear, the fragile human determination to protect his comrades shone clear. The damaged engine coughed beneath them, a reminder of their vulnerability. Yet the gunner kept firing, each burst a shield woven from steel and resolve. The cold air pressed against the thin panes of glass, carrying the distant sounds of war, as the plane fought on through the sky's indifferent vastness. The sky remained a heavy gray, the wind whipping dust and ash across the battered field. Small bursts of gunfire echoed intermittently, distant yet relentless, a constant reminder of the ongoing battle. The gunner sat rigid behind the makeshift barricade, the cold metal of his weapon biting through his gloves. His fingers, once nimble, now trembled slightly, numb from the ceaseless grip and the biting cold. Each squeeze of the trigger sent a jolt through his aching shoulders. He counted rounds silently, the ammunition dwindling with every staccato burst. The familiar weight of the rifle was both a comfort and a burden, anchoring him to his post even as exhaustion crept deeper into his bones. His breath came out in shallow clouds, mingling with the smell of burnt powder and damp earth. His gaze flicked to the figure beside him, the electrician. Sweat and grime darkened the man's uniform, but the faint gleam of a hastily patched wire looped near his belt caught the gunner's eye. That dangerous shortcut, forged in defiance of the strict protocols they had sworn to uphold, was now a lifeline. It pulsed faintly with electricity, a fragile thread of hope in the bleakness that surrounded them. The gunner's mind drifted briefly to the risk the electrician had taken. The rules were clear, no shortcuts, no improvisations under fire. Yet necessity had forced their hands. Survival demanded bending those invisible lines, even when it meant courting disaster. That risk now bound them together, a silent pact forged in the chaos. A sharp crack split the air nearby. The gunner's head snapped up, eyes scanning for the source. Smoke curled from a distant shell crater, the earth still trembling from the impact. His heart pounded, muscles tensing, but there was no time to falter. He glanced again at his companion. Blood stained the sleeve of the electrician's jacket, a dark smear spreading slowly across the fabric. The gunner's breath caught. There was no time for questions, no moment to voice concern. The battle pressed on, relentless and unforgiving. He saw the man's jaw tighten, a brief wince, but the electrician's fingers never left the wire. The gunner shifted slightly, trying to ease the ache in his shoulders, but the weight of duty held him steady. The rifle felt heavier now, its cold steel grounding him amid the storm outside. The intermittent shriek of distant shells, the sharp bark of rifles, and the murmur of whispered orders blended into a harsh symphony of war. He realized the shortcut wire was no longer just a tool. It had become a part of him, threaded through their shared struggle. That thin, trembling current was a lifeline against the encompassing darkness, a fragile beacon in the relentless torrent of gunfire and fear. His fingers brushed against the steel grip again, steadying. The cold seeped into his bones, but beneath it a quiet resolve stirred. The battle was far from over. The storm outside raged on, but within the cramped shelter of their position, an unspoken understanding held firm, a trust in each other, and in the slender hope that the shortcut wire represented. The gunner swallowed hard, his eyes locking once more on the bloodied sleeve. There was pain there, real and immediate, yet the man beside him did not falter. Together they clung to that small spark of defiance, a silent stand against the overwhelming tide. A distant explosion shook the ground beneath them, sending a plume of dirt and debris skyward. The gunner's hands tightened on the weapon, fingers numbed but unyielding. The ache in his shoulders was a steady reminder of the hours endured, yet he remained rooted, eyes scanning, breath steady. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the bitter scent of smoke and loss. Inside, the gunner held his position, the shortcut wire humming faintly in the background, a quiet testament to the fragile, hard-won hope that kept them alive. The battered formation drifted slowly back across the gray sky, engines humming unevenly beneath weary wings. Below, the patchwork fields stretched out, mottled by the fading light of late afternoon. The air was thick with smoke and the faint metallic tang of spent gunpowder. Inside the gunner's cramped turret, his gloved hands rested heavily on the empty ammunition belts. The once full rows of brass casings lay scattered across the floor, gleaming dull gold in the weak light. His eyes lingered on the hollow shells, the silence between each moment growing heavier. He released the wire loop that had secured the belts, fingers stiff from cold and tension. Slowly, he wiped the loop clean on the worn fabric of his flight jacket, the rough material catching on the frayed edges. The metal gleamed faintly, smeared with grease and grime from hours of battle. Carefully, he tucked the loop away into a small pocket beneath his seat, the motion deliberate and quiet. The gunner's breath fogged the glass around him, mixing with the scent of sweat and oil inside the cramped turret. He shifted his weight, muscles aching from the strain of holding his position. Around the cabin, other crewmen moved with measured steps, the weight of exhaustion evident in their slow gestures. Heads were counted again, voices low and hushed. The soft murmur of whispered thanks passed between them, fragile as the thin clouds drifting outside. One man struck a match, the small flare of light briefly illuminating a face lined with dirt and weariness. He held a cigarette between trembling fingers, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. The faint crackle of the flame was swallowed by the distant drone of engines and the rustling of canvas. The gunner exhaled slowly, the smoke from a forgotten cigarette mixing with the stale air. His eyes scanned the dim interior, noting the quiet fatigue that settled over his comrades like a shroud. Each man bore the invisible marks of survival, stiff limbs, tight jaws, and eyes that avoided meeting one another. Outside the turret's glass, the landscape moved steadily closer. Fields darkened under gathering shadows, the outlines of farmhouses and tree lines growing sharper in the fading light. The silence was occasionally broken by the soft rattle of loose equipment, shifting with the plane's movement. Across the small field at their destination, the electrician stood waiting, his uniform dusted with soot and sweat. Their eyes met briefly through the glass, a shared recognition passing between them. No words were spoken. The gunner offered a slight tilt of his head, a gesture heavy with acknowledgement and unspoken respect. The electrician returned the motion, his expression subdued but steady. Neither needed to speak. Their glance carried the weight of what had been endured. Behind them, the rest of the crew settled into a fragile calm, the tension ebbing slowly but not disappearing. The aircraft creaked quietly, its wounded frame bearing them forward through the still air. Outside, the first stars began to emerge, cold points of light in the darkening sky. Inside, the gunner's fingers traced the edge of the empty belt container, the absence of ammunition a silent testament to the fight just past. The room smelled of sweat, oil, and the faint acrid sting of cordite. His eyes held a distant look, haunted by the ghosts of those no longer there. The formation's slow progress toward home carried the weight of loss and honor alike. Each man carried his own memory of what had been sacrificed. The sounds of flight blended with the whispered prayers and quiet farewells that hung invisibly in the air. As the plane neared the field, the gunner gazed outward one last time. The earth seemed both distant and close, a fragile line between survival and the unknown. The subtle tilt of his head toward the electrician remained, a silent bond forged in shared endurance and respect. The engines hummed a steady, tired rhythm. Inside, the crew prepared for landing with gentle movements, careful not to disturb the fragile peace. The empty belts, the spent casings, the quiet gestures, all spoke of duty carried through the darkest hours. The formation limped toward the ground, shadows lengthening as night approached. Inside the still cockpit, the gunner sat quietly, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where home awaited, distant and uncertain. The debriefing room was cold, its pale walls punctuated only by the dull glow of a single overhead light. The air carried the faint scent of damp uniforms and stale cigarette smoke, settling heavily on the tired faces gathered around the long wooden table. Squadron members sat rigid, their postures betraying exhaustion and a lingering tension from the day's flight. At the head of the table, the squadron commander, a lean man in his 40s with a weathered face, folded his hands deliberately. His eyes narrowed as he addressed the group, voice low but firm. "We received reports of unusual procedures during today's mission," he began, glancing from one airman to another. "I want an explanation. What happened out there?" The gunner sat motionless, hands clenched tightly in his lap. His eyes, shadowed by fatigue and something deeper, avoided the commander's gaze. The faint, persistent hum of distant engines seeped through the room's single window, mingling with the soft rustle of papers. He remained silent, the weight of unspoken events pressing against his chest. Beside him, the radio operator shifted awkwardly on the wooden chair, his left arm encased in a faded canvas sling. The rough fabric rubbed against his uniform's worn sleeve, the slight movement drawing the attention of the commander. The man simply shrugged, a subtle gesture that spoke more than words, uncertainty, perhaps, or the unwillingness to betray a comrade. On the table, barely visible beneath a folded map, lay a small wire loop. Concealed carefully in the gunner's pocket during the flight, it now rested silent. Its cold metal surface caught a faint glimmer from the overhead light, unnoticed by the others. The loop was a quiet witness to the day's secret, unmentioned and unseen. The commander's voice broke through the thick silence. "We understand the crew faced heavy resistance and faced effective return fire. I want to hear the official account." He tapped a pen against a blotter, signaling the start of the formal report. A junior officer began to read aloud, his tone steady and measured. During the mission, the squadron encountered strong enemy anti-aircraft defenses. Despite this, the crew maintained formation and continued their attack runs with precision. Casualties were minimal given the intensity of fire. The words were clipped, factual, betraying none of the underlying strain. No mention was made of the wire loop, nor of the hurried improvisations that had saved lives in the air. The report carefully omitted any reference to shortcuts or the copper wire's presence, leaving out the fear that had momentarily gripped the men. The official narrative was one of discipline and resilience, unblemished by doubt or hesitation. The gunner's gaze finally lifted, meeting the commander's. In his eyes lingered a quiet burden, the suppressed memory of a decision made under fire. The weight of honor pressed upon him, demanding silence. To speak would risk more than reprimand. It would unravel the fragile trust between men. Outside, the wind whispered against the cracked windowpane, carrying the faint scent of rain and distant fields scarred by conflict. Inside the room, time seemed suspended, held in the unspoken truths and the measured cadence of official words. As the debriefing concluded, the commander nodded once, a brief acknowledgement of endurance. Dismissed, the men stood slowly, the room filling with the soft scrape of boots on worn floorboards. The gunner slipped the wire loop back into his pocket, its presence a silent testament to a day's survival not recorded in any report. The radio operator adjusted his sling with a tired hand, casting a brief glance at his friend. There was no need for words. Their shared experience lay between them, a quiet bond forged in the crucible of war. Outside, the gathering twilight deepened, shadows lengthening across the airfield where the squadron's planes waited in silent rows. The debriefing room emptied, leaving behind only the faint scent of sweat and the echo of measured voices. The official record would tell one story, but the men knew another, one held quietly, honor intact, beneath the surface of history's pages. The hangar's shadows stretched long in the late afternoon light, filtering through grimy windows. Rows of aircraft stood silent, their metal skins mottled with dust and oil stains. The air smelled faintly of fuel and sweat, a heavy stillness hanging over the space. Near one weathered P-51 Mustang, the electrician moved methodically along the wing's edge, hands steady despite the day's fatigue. He produced a small coil of wire loops from his pocket, their dull steel catching faint gleams of light. No clipboard, no official forms, only the weight of necessity in his careful grip. One by one, he handed the loops to the gunners waiting nearby, their faces marked by exhaustion but brightened with keen attention. Each man received the wire with a brief nod, silent acknowledgement passing between them like a quiet pact. No words passed, the ritual needed no explanation. The gunners, some still bearing the grime of earlier missions, gathered close together. Their fingers, calloused and stained, showed the wire loops how to fit, threading them carefully through worn connectors beneath the machine gun mounts. The pace was unhurried but deliberate, taught by necessity and shaped by countless flights through flak and fire. The newest crewmen watched in concentrated silence, absorbing every motion, every subtle adjustment. Their eyes flickered between the hands working before them and the planes outside, where distant engines hummed in preparation. The small wire loops, so simple in form, felt suddenly heavy with meaning, links in a chain of survival stretching back through every sortie flight. No superior officers interrupted the exchange. The hangar's usual orderliness seemed suspended here, replaced by a quiet rebellion woven tightly into the fabric of daily life. Each man knew the risk. This shortcut defied protocol but promised a slender chance of endurance. As the loops passed from hand to hand, the gunners shared more than just technical skill. The wordless teaching carried the weight of trust, a bond forged in the skies where lives balanced on fragile wires and steady aim. The hangar's cold concrete echoed only with soft metallic clicks and the occasional scrape of boots against floorboards. The electrician paused for a moment, glancing toward the open doors where the sun's dying light streaked the apron. He allowed himself a brief, tired smile, a recognition of the small defiance in their routine. None spoke of it openly, but the gesture meant something deeper, a commitment to each other beyond orders or regulations. The wire loops became more than mere tools. They transformed into symbols of shared fate. Each loop slipped into place beneath the gun mounts like a silent guardian, a hidden shield against the chaos waiting beyond the airfield. Their presence was never announced, but it was understood. New gunners, still young and uncertain, often sought the glances of those who had survived missions past. In those looks lay unspoken lessons about honor and survival, about the fragile margins between life and death. The loops were one of those margins, a small act of care and defiance that spoke of the men's unyielding will. Outside, engines roared to life, muffled by the hangar walls but unmistakable in their urgency. The crew straightened, fingers lingering a moment longer on the wire loops before stepping away. Preparations resumed, but the quiet knowledge shared in those moments persisted. The shortcut was never recorded, never acknowledged in reports. It was a secret woven into the very structure of the planes, a silent code passed between men who had seen the worst and still chose to fly again. It linked generations of airmen through invisible threads stronger than any steel. As the sun dipped below the hangar's ridge, casting long shadows across the concrete, the men dispersed. Their footsteps echoed softly, mingling with distant voices calling last orders. The wire loops remained hidden beneath gun mounts, unnoticed by most but vital to those who mattered. In the stillness that followed, the hangar seemed to hold its breath. The small acts of rebellion, the quiet lessons, and the shared trust formed an unspoken testament to honor amid loss. The planes waited, ready once more to carry their crews into the uncertain skies, bound by fragile wires and steadfast resolve. The men had no way to guarantee survival, but they preserved something nearly as precious, each other's lives and a code that refused to break. The wire loops, simple and unseen, embodied that fragile honor, a silent promise etched into the metal and memory of war. The shortcut wire loop was never documented in manuals or official reports, its existence known only through whispered stories and subtle gestures. It lived in the worn palms of gunners, in the brief clasp of hands before a mission, in the silent space between fear and hope. For those men, the loop did not guarantee safety, but offered one more second to aim, one more chance to survive. The electrician who fashioned it took a risk beyond orders, knowing any discovery might mean punishment. Yet that small act of defiance became a shield, unspoken but effective, a thread of courage woven into the chaos of war. The shortcut was not sanctioned by commanders, yet it carried the weight of lives counting on it. On cold mornings, under gray skies thick with smoke, the gunners gripped their controls, feeling the faint presence of that hidden loop beneath their fingers. It was a silent promise of resistance against impossible odds, a quiet rebellion embedded in metal and wire. The war was shaped by strategies and commands, but survival hinged on these subtle choices made far from headquarters and battle plans. As the conflict waned and the guns fell silent, the shortcut wire loop faded from use, its form lost to time and the clean pages of history. But its echo remained, in every crewman who had returned, in every glance exchanged between men who understood what it meant. It endured in the quiet acts of courage that did not make headlines, but made survival possible. In the end, the war was measured not only by victories and losses, but by the honor of those who, in moments unseen, chose to protect their brothers by any means they could. The shortcut was more than a tool. It was a testament to the resilience quietly sustained amidst destruction.